Hello everyone, this is Heath at Mountaineer Motor Tours. I want to welcome you to part 2 of Designing Asheville, the history of Six Associates Incorporated. Now, Six Associates was an incredibly prolific architecture and engineering firm based here in Asheville, North Carolina. Now, if you have missed it, we do have a recording of part 1. This is a re-recording of a presentation that was given Thursday, November 13th, 2025 for the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County at Warren Wilson Presbyterian Church. Tonight we're going to cover the extensive history of this firm as they reached beyond World War II into the 20th century. And what we wanted to do this time, although Six Associates numbered many different employees through their history, so they would top out at a peak of about 80 to 100 employees through their most prolific period of the 1950s and 60s. But we wanted to continue the theme of our original 5 architects and 1 engineer from the previous presentation so that we have a continuous thread of information. So where we're going to pick up off is kind of where I left you guys last time, on a little bit of a cliffhanger as Asheville was trying to figure out which way was up at the beginning of the Great Depression in 1930. So to recap, we're going to be talking about 5 different architects and 1 engineer, and those are architects Stuart Rogers, Henry Gaines, Anthony Lord, William Waldo Dodge Jr., Earl Stilwell, and engineer Charles Waddell, who was the chief engineer for the Biltmore Company as well as his own company, Charles E. Waddell and Company. Now, just to summarize where we left off in the last presentation as far as what the city achieved in terms of infrastructure and progress, there were over 40 miles of streets paved and 500,000 square yards of hard surfaces that were laid down in this period of prolific change. We had 44 miles of water mains laid and 30 miles of sanitary sewer line. We had built a city zoo, a recreation park, McCormick Field, Memorial Stadium, and our municipal golf course. We had built 7 schools, and we had tacked up a debt of about $17 million, and that's in 1927 dollars, so that'd be about a third of a billion today. And this is just for Asheville City in the metro area, so this is not even including the outskirts of town in Buncombe County. Now, as we mentioned, development in the 1920s was just going gangbusters. It was a total boom time until we had the Depression hit in 1930. And during this period of the decade of the 1920s, we established really a modern framework for the city that had not existed before. And some of that was due to a modern city plan drafted and developed by a city planner named John Nolan that we talked about extensively in part 1. And that also involved establishing several prominent neighborhoods that would become historic today. And those are Grove Park, Lakeview Park, which centers around a man-made lake named Beaver Lake, and the town of Biltmore Forest, which would all be home to wonderful high-end homes. Now, as we talked about a little bit, Asheville had been funneling all this debt primarily through 1 bank in town, and that was the Central Bank and Trust. And we had funneled the majority of our debt through there, and they were parsing that money out into other investments like rental property, the stock market, and we all know how that ended up with the Great Depression happening. They lost everything. And so it would be that would be October 1929 is the Great Depression, and then in November of 1930, 8 banks, including that Central Bank and Trust, would close, never to reopen again. Our mayor at the time was a gentleman named Gallatin Roberts, who had been our mayor at the beginning of the decade. He was then usurped by Mayor John Cathy, who led us through much of this development and progress as far as changing Asheville into really a modern metropolis. He was run out of town basically because of the amount of debt that he racked up and the amount of money he spent. This really upset the citizens of Asheville and kind of signaled the warning sirens that something was off. But rather than trying to steer the ship straight, Gallatin Roberts decided to doctor the financial statements of the city of Asheville, hoping that the bank and the stock market would catch up and our coffers would be filled again. Now, because of that stock market crash, that did not happen, and Mayor Gallatin Roberts, as well as several key employees of the Central Bank and Trust, were indicted for financial fraud and mishandling. Now, several of them did go to prison. Mayor Gallatin Roberts did take his own life and left behind a note for the citizens of Asheville. And this really put us in a fairly bad position at a dark time. Now, it took us a couple years to work out all of this debt that we had accrued and how we were going to pay it off. So in 1936, we decided to consolidate both our city and county debt. And rather than declaring bankruptcy, we decided that we were actually going to restructure that loan, establish what is called a bond sinking fund, which is basically a savings account where we would deposit money monthly so that when it came time to meet this balloon payment at the end of a 40-year term, we could pay it all off. Now, the debt consolidated between both the city of Asheville, that's the metro city, and the Buncombe County consisted of about $158.8 million in 1936. So that would be about 2.8 billion today. And it took us until 1978 to pay that debt off. So you've got to think this would be quite a burden for the citizens of Asheville to carry for a long time. Now that somewhat limited what we could do as far as Asheville. So this basically put the brakes on all construction, new engineering projects and development, and anything that could have led to urban renewal later. Now, at the time, we still had a lot of people coming to North Carolina, and specifically Asheville. So North Carolina is a right-to-work state, so there was not a problem with dealing with unions for major manufacturers that were moving their operations down here. We've always had a high-quality water supply from the North Fork watershed that was developed by our engineer Charles Waddell we spoke about. And water was needed for many manufacturing processes, whether it was food products or consumer goods. And this was also an era when we started to have a migration of African Americans from the Deep South coming to Asheville for these manufacturing opportunities. So we were also seeing the African American population grow and Asheville's population becoming more diverse. And it was because of these changing times, our financial position, as well as different residents in the city that would ultimately begin to change the needs of what we would need as a growing city going forward. So all this being said, where does that leave our architects and engineers? Well, they've got to find new lines of work. It's almost impossible to do any construction or design projects. So Charles Waddell, who we talked about, who had been chief engineer at the Biltmore Estate, did much to improve their infrastructure there, had his own company, Charles E. Waddell, who was doing engineering for himself as well as for Biltmore at this time. And he was very busy working a lot on these facilities for these large manufacturing companies. And just to name a few, we've got so much going on at this time, but I wanted to highlight some of the companies that would have very long history in Asheville and that were connected to Mr. Waddell. And those were Beacon Manufacturing, which was a large blanket making company in Swannanoa and making other fine textile goods. Champion Fiber Mill in Canton that was processing raw pulp and tree wood for paper products. And Inca Rayon that was making rayon for silk or nylon stockings as well as tire cording later on, things like that. That was a Dutch rayon company, and they needed somebody to design their large factories as well as power plants and engineer water supplies that could help feed and cool these plants. That was Charles Waddell. So this was a big part of what he was doing as Asheville was transitioning from primarily tourism and a mountain craft economy to more manufacturing as these large industrialists who had visited here on vacation were realizing this was a great place to grow their business. Now, Charles Waddell, this would also be a period of immense difficulty for him, not only from a work standpoint, from a health standpoint. So as a young man, he was injured riding one of Asheville's electric streetcars. He had his head out the window and hit a pole, which led to a traumatic head injury that would ultimately develop into a brain tumor. And he had this successfully operated on and removed during the late teens and led a very prolific, vigorous career despite this head injury. But in the early 1930s, he has another tumor come back and is shipped downstate for a very specific operation. Now, the operation is successful in removing a brain tumor, but it ultimately leads to paralysis for Charles Waddell. And this makes it very uncomfortable for him to engage in everyday society. So he cannot really sit, stand, or lie down in one position for more than an hour at a time. So he has very fitful nights of sleep and doesn't get to rest a lot. But despite this, he still leads a very vigorous working life and is said to always be in a pleasant mood by many of his contemporaries. Now, Anthony Lord, he's one of our up-and-coming architects at this time. So we're going to be talking about Anthony Lord, Henry Gaines, and Stuart Rogers. Are all young architects that have been born around the turn of the century, and they've seen Asheville as young men grow into this incredible boom town and then totally collapse. So their perspective is going to be very different than some of the older established architects. So Anthony Lord, as a young man, he's very inventive and has this engineering mind. His father, William Lord, is an architect here in Asheville, and he pivots back to something that was just a hobby as a young man, which was blacksmithing. And as a young man in the backyard of his parents' home on Flint Street in Montford, he built a small blacksmith's forge and a bellows system that would pump air into the heating to heat up this raw iron that he could then hammer out. So he was able to attain some equipment. This is a picture of him using a large power hammer. And he would grow this little company called Flint Street Forgings and hire several other blacksmiths, including Daniel Boone VI, who was very prolific here in Asheville. So his little company, Flint Architectural Forgings, prospered in the backyard of his parents' home. And he was making wonderful architectural lanterns, weather vanes, ornamental ironwork like grates, stairwells, and a lot of door hardware. And he would ultimately produce a little catalog and sell these out of the office at his father's office on Church Street. So there was this little brick building, 17.5 Church Street, where his father had his architectural practice, and Tony was selling his wrought iron forgings. Now these are just a couple examples of some of the door hardware he made. I mean, there was just many items, a very prolific career. So some of the lanterns and door hardware. And this ironwork would end up in some very important places like Yale University, where Anthony was an alumni. And so a lot of his door hardware is on the campus library, as well as many of the smaller, what they call colleges, inside of that campus. It also appears in the National Cathedral and many homes and businesses around Asheville. So he did some work that was quite ornate in Biltmore Forest on some of the homes, as far as window coverings like large bars in an era where people were concerned about kidnapping after the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping, and lots of door hardware and lanterns. Now, Tony Lord experienced his own hardship, not only from the diversion of his career, where he was a fledgling architect, but the death of his father, William Lord, in 1933. So his father was on the way home from a North Carolina American Institute of Architects conference, where he had just been elected president and was involved in a terrible motor accident, another car crash with another vehicle. And he leaves behind this incredible legacy of many buildings that are still in operation. And he was an influence and was close with his son, Tony. Now, Lord is going to begin a new career. So he does have a fairly prolific career as a blacksmith, but his architectural career does start to pick up in the mid to late 30s. Now, one of the more prominent projects was one of the last projects he did with his father, and that was the design of St. Mark's Lutheran Church on Liberty Street, just off of Merriman Avenue in North Asheville in 1930s. When they first pinned the design, they would continue to revitalize that through 1931, and then it would be completed in 1932. And outside of the church are many examples of Tony's ironwork. So these lanterns on the exterior of the church are done by Flint Architectural Forgings in addition to the architecture work. Now, Tony also designed another church in Barnesville that is Dillingham Presbyterian Church, which is this beautiful rock stone structure that's very quaint in its origins. He did a small project for Asheville School for Boys, which was the Bement Music House, and this was a small little charming cottage for the very in-depth listening of music. So this is not where music would be rehearsed, but a space to educate on music history and listen to music. He also designed the Bement Guest House. So this was named for the chancellor at the time, and this is where guests that were coming to visit the chancellor of Asheville School would stay. It also appears to have Tony Lord ironwork on the outside of it and some of the lanterns as well. Now, one of his biggest commissions is going to be the design of the Asheville Citizen-Times building in 1939. And this is going to be really the first new modern design in downtown Asheville since the outbreak of the Depression in 1930. And this is what would gain Lord notoriety as bringing modern style to Asheville. So we don't really hear the term Art Deco until the mid-60s, but modern or Art Moderne is this French kind of European styling that is coming to Asheville. It's bringing clean lines and a very futuristic look. And it's known for its cast concrete structure, as well as terrazzo floors and glass block walls. to give it a very unique look. And this had to be done in a very compressed time frame. It was completed in about a year for the newspaper, which was moving out of its old headquarters. Now, Lord also picked up several other commissions for residential projects in this modern style, and one of those was a house for an ophthalmologist named Dr. Sprinza Weisenblatt. She came to Asheville in the 1920s to study under a noted ophthalmologist and establish a practice here. She had connections in Germany, where she was originally from, with Walter Gropius, the architect who established the Bauhaus Design School, and his associate architect and partner, Marcel Breuer. And they were escaping a lot of the Nazi persecution at this time and came to America along with many other German artists and architects and designers. And it would be Gropius that would become established with an experimental school in Black Mountain, North Carolina, called Black Mountain College. And he would serve on the board there. Breuer was running their office in Boston, Massachusetts. And it happened so that Weisenblatt was an acquaintance of Walter Gropius. Her family knew him in Germany, and she wrote to him to design a new house for her in North Asheville in the Lakeview Park neighborhood. He was very busy at the time and put her in touch with Marcel Breuer. Now, it just so happened that one of her patients was Anthony Lord, who had long struggled with macular degeneration and was going to Dr. Weisenblatt. And she assigned Lord, her good friend, to be the supervising architect who would carry out and execute many projects for Breuer while he was out of state. So a lot of the work was done by correspondence with Breuer and with Lord supervising and adding some of his own touches on the project. And it turned into this very interesting modern, it's actually a duplex. So the house is split into two parts. And this is on Marlborough Road across from Beaver Lake in North Asheville. And this is right when the U.S. involvement is starting to come to a head in World War II, and many materials are being diverted to the war effort. So they had to finish this house fairly quickly to get it done in time for the materials to still be there. Now, another house that Lord did was for a couple of writers named Tom and Jane Polsky. And this was a house up near Weaverville that's kind of in a similar modern style. And the Polskys are really known for cultivating this art scene in Asheville. So they were multi-talented people, writers, they loved art, and they had Lord design this beautiful modern house for them. Now, one of the things that they did for fun was they had a little string quartet music that would play chamber music, and they never really performed, but it was just something that was done for fun. And Lord was a flute player, so they had a little group called the Rock Bottom Quartet that just played together for fun, and this is Lord and one of the Polskys in the living room of this house. And it still looks very similar today. It has kind of an interesting combination of both modern and rustic design elements to it. Now, one of our other up-and-coming architects at this time is Stuart Rogers, and he has come to Asheville as a young man. He's originally born in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he matriculated through the Asheville public school system, and he went to Duke University for a degree in business administration. He would then go to Harvard University for a master's in architecture, and he was also a talented tennis player and athlete. And when he graduated from Harvard, he went up to New York City looking for jobs, and he happened to interview with a couple different architectural firms. And at one interview, one of the interviewers was quite candid with him. He said, "Mr. Rogers, do you have a home that you can go back to in Asheville, North Carolina?" He says, "Well, yes, sir, I sure do." He said, "I would advise that you go back there and stay with your parents because there are no jobs to be had here." So Stuart Rogers, he returns to Asheville and he begins working for the city property tax department. And then later he goes on and does surveys of water lines as well as electrical supplies. A lot of this is done work he does in West Asheville in the Malvern Hills area. Soon enough, though, he gets the opportunity to work with an established architect named Ronald Green, and they combine their prowess to form a firm named Green and Rogers Architecture, which is in the Grove Arcade building. And Ronald Green, now he has a fairly prolific career here in Asheville, but I want to highlight just two of his more notable buildings of many, which are the Jackson Building, which is our first skyscraper in Western North Carolina in this incredible Gothic revival style, as well as the Longchamp Apartments that are on Macon Avenue as you're proceeding to the Grove Park Inn. And they're both in this wonderful, exaggerated 1920s style. He does many other municipal buildings, several schools in the area, but just to name a few, those are two that really stand out. And he and Stuart Rogers get the opportunity to commission several gas stations, which are still doing well at this time in the 1930s. And these are done for a gentleman named Edwin Shuey, who commissions them to design 3 different Shell gas stations. One of those is located down on Patton Avenue. There's another in the town of Biltmore, and one on Haywood Road. So the one on the left-hand side of the screen, this is home to Spicer Green Jewelers today. So it was transformed into a jewelry store in the 1980s. It was originally Wiccan Green Jewelers, and they added an addition onto the back of it. But this is what it would have looked like in the 1930s in this streamlined Art Moderne style. Now, Shuey, as I mentioned, did have him design a station in Biltmore, as well as one on Haywood Road, which is currently the Gas Up building and convenience store today on Haywood Road. It doesn't bear as much resemblance. It's covered in layers of thick purple paint, but it is one of these Shuey stations that we believe were all designed by Stuart Rogers. Now, they also picked up another commission for the Gulf Station on Biltmore Avenue. This would be home to Wicked Weed Brewing today, but this was done for a proprietor named E.S. Kuhn of Gulf Oil in 1940. They would also design the beautiful Bon Marché department store in this Art Moderne style in the late 1930s on Haywood Street in downtown Asheville. Now, another architect that's going to find himself struggling is William Waldo Dodge. And this is a multi-talented individual. And during the 1920s, he's built up a nice practice of silversmithing, where he's making these beautiful silver pieces in a hammered waterfall style. He has a fairly established architecture practice doing arts and crafts as well as Tudor-style residences and commercial buildings. And he's even a painter. But he finds himself struggling with his fledgling firm as many of his projects disappear. Now, he also gets the invitation for a commission from Asheville School, where he had formerly taught physics and drafting in 1920. And they ask him to help kind of fill out some of the rough edges in a building on campus called Boyd Chapel that had been designed in the memory of a student who lost his life at a young age, and his mother paid for the entirety of its construction. But there were several problems. The interior was too dark with stained glass that was very opaque and didn't let light in, and there was still missing furniture that had been never delivered, so it needed some interior decorating and better lighting. And Dodge was called in to help complete this. And in addition to that, they asked him to design a new series of stained glass windows, which he did at the back of Boyd Chapel. So these incredible stained glass windows were designed and built by Dodge in his shop in Biltmore Forest. So if you can imagine silversmithing, furniture making, architecture, stained glass, there are almost no limits to what these architects can do. He also designed several Art Moderne buildings in downtown Asheville on Battery Park Avenue, as well as buildings out in Upper Hominy, or Candler, as it was known at the time. And I mentioned several large manufacturing operations out there, one of which was Inca Rayon. And in addition to some of the other model towns, like if you think about the Hershey factory that had its own model town for employees, as well as Beacon that had Beacon Village in Swannanoa, Inca had its own neighborhood for workers and a small company store, things like that, that was called Inca Village. So Dodge designed several prominent homes in there and many other residences, one of which that is more well known as the Inca Plant Manager's House, close to Biltmore Lake, as well as the Sulphur Springs filling station. And he, as well as Anthony Lord and Charles Waddell, were doing work for Inca Rayon in a large building. Now, one of the other young up-and-coming architects was Henry Gaines, who's also trying to find his footings after he lost the commission for the Fleetwood Hotel in Laurel Park in Hendersonville. So he really finds himself at rock bottom at one point, sitting in his office twiddling his thumbs. So he's in a small office in the Public Service Building in downtown Asheville, which is owned by noted developer Tench Cox, who we spoke about briefly in part 1. This is a beautiful Art Deco building that was designed by Beecham and LeGrand, and he's up on the 11th floor looking out the window at the mountain view when he's approached by a gentleman who's kind of a traveling salesman. And he's got a case of a product called King's Malum, which is a dietary supplement. It's kind of a thick apple juice that he brings in, and he says, "Mr. Gaines, I think I can put you in business making a fine living." And Gaines is impressed by this man. He comes in this beautiful overcoat, a nice suit, fine hat, and he starts telling about King's Malum, this apple juice with many different vitamins that is sold to doctors' offices as well as individuals. So he travels around with him for the day and watches how he delivers the product and sells it and goes into business. And he establishes a rapport with doctors' offices and former architectural clients. And after about a year, he finally gets a call in his office one day to redo this beautiful old manor home off of Victoria Road that is known as Fernahurst. And it's a young couple that would like to develop it into their primary residence. So he turns in his notice at Kings Malem, delivers his last load of apple juice, never to do it again. And he begins on his first commission, and that gets him back into the architecture business. Now, he does turn this story into a memoir that is called Kings Malem. So it's a wonderful book if you can find a copy that gives you a little bit of an idea of how his career progressed. Now, one of his other large projects was for an industrialist named Carl Bauman, who was from Florida, and he wanted to build a beautiful ranch home out in Fletcher. And when I say ranch, I mean for cattle ranching. So he was in the livestock and many other pursuits. So Gaines designed this beautiful chink and log style home with stone that had elements of 1940s modern in it. And that took him a fairly good while to design and complete. He was traveling out to Fairview by car every day, standing in the field, watching these stonemasons expertly put all these pieces of stone together. And when it was done, Carl Bauman, now this is on 1,000 acres, Carl Bauman calls him and says, "I've got a load of 1,000 cattle coming here by train car. Can you meet them and help my ranch hands unload these cattle?" And this is in an era when you would do almost anything for a client or to make a sale. So Henry Gaines says, "Well, I'm fairly adept at a horse." So he got on a horse saddle as well as with the 3 ranch hands, and they got all of these cattle out to the Half Circle B ranch. Now, sadly, this home does not exist anymore. It was destroyed in a fire. There were several other homes that Gaines was working on at this time that would be part of his resurgence into architecture, and this would be this beautiful home for Louis Lipinski off of Kimberly Avenue in this incredible Tudor style. And Louis and his father, Solomon Lipinski, had a chain of department stores called Bon Marché, one of which was located in downtown Asheville on Haywood Street. He also designed this incredible home, the Edgar Fordtron home off of Macon Avenue, close to the Grove Park Inn. So again, in this lovely large Tudor style. It is said to have William Waldo Dodge interior hardware on many of the doors. Now, Gaines also had a family member that was involved with Coca-Cola bottling facilities. So in the late 1930s, he was asked to design the new Coca-Cola bottling plant in Asheville. And this building would be located on Biltmore Avenue just before reaching St. Joseph and Mission hospitals. And on the outside, it was covered in these incredible yellow glazed, they're called glass stone tiles from the Owens Corning Company that covered the outside of the building. And it also made use of glass block walls, just like Lord's Citizen Times building. On the inside of the lobby was an incredible, beautiful floor. So this was a terrazzo floor that detailed a map of all of the Coca-Cola bottling operations in Western North Carolina. It also featured what I call the Gaines dramatic staircase that was really a feat of engineering that he would use in residences and other commercial structures. Inside of the lobby were cast plaster Coca-Cola bottles around the top of the ceiling, as well as large George Massa photographs of the Pisgah National Forest in large black and white. And we can see that incredible Art Moderne desk at the front. He also designed the Union Bus Station, which would be home to Trailways buses on Cox Avenue, again in that modern style. So if we look at the interior, we'll see this Art Moderne ticket counter with a large portrait of a bus up on the wall in that black and white, kind of just like in the Coca-Cola building. And you'll see a glass window at the top of the ceiling where the second floor would have been offices for folks working in that building. Sadly, that building does not exist anymore. It is on the site of the current Asheville bus station for the Asheville City buses. Now, Gaines also designed the Woolworth store on Haywood Street as well that had 2 floors of retail space and then offices up on the second floor. Now, one of the architects, Earl Stillwell, he was fairly established at this time and about 15 years older than the other architects, but he lost his entire business down in Hendersonville. He was really more prolific in Henderson and Transylvania counties. But during the 1930s, Movie theaters were a cheap way for people to have entertainment, also to enjoy a nice air-conditioned day out of the hot summer heat. And he was able to get the contract with a theater chain to continue building movie theaters all throughout North Carolina and the Southeast. So I want to highlight just a couple of these in that art moderne style, like the Winston Theater down in Winston-Salem, the Coed Theater in Brevard, as well as the Ambassador Theater in Concord. So he did about 38 of these different art. Now these architects started meeting regularly for lunch, and this would be different members that were involved in the North Carolina AIA Western North Carolina chapters. That would be Rogers, Gaines, Lord, and Dodge. And they would be meeting for lunch at the beautiful Douglas Ellington designed S&W cafeteria. And they started to get rumblings that there was an opportunity for what would be called at this time low rental housing projects. And this would be government subsidized housing that was pioneered as part of FDR's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal program that would seek to establish better conditions for people that were considered to be living in a slum. Now, this would be kind of what we would consider later urban renewal, as it would be targeted a lot towards African American neighborhoods, which at that time could be considered to be run down and were, quote, to be an eyesore to the community. So this would start to begin the era of kind of a more complicated time. And Rogers, Gaines, Lord, and Dodge all discussed the idea of combining their architectural practices to take advantage of some of these government programs that would give them a larger commission doing some of these larger projects. So where this took place in Asheville, primarily what were thought of slums at the time in the Asheville Metro District were the area of Eagle and Valley Streets. And this would be later known as the historic African American Business District. But if you can imagine, if we're looking at this photograph, the street running through the center of it is South Charlotte Street. The school at the top of the hill would be Stevens Lee, the black high school at the time of segregation in Asheville. And there were many homes in this area that would later be demolished for urban renewal. So just to give a couple idea, these are actually photographs taken by Anthony Lord from the top of the Buncombe County Courthouse. So we can see where some of the buildings are beginning to look a little bit run down, and this would be the area, a lot of this would be cleared for urban renewal in the 1950s and 1960s. Now this program was halted, these public housing, with the outbreak of World War II. And part of the difficulty was there was an inability to obtain materials due to rationing at the time. Most of our workforce of young men were sent off to fight the war, as well as a lot of the women that would go to factories. And individually, these architects of Lord, Dodge, Gaines, Stillwell, Rogers did not have the capacity or the bandwidth to compete with much larger architectural firms across the country. So again, they struck up the idea of combining powers. Now, the other thing is that the U.S. government and the military are going to come to occupy Asheville in a big way. So they take over several different municipal buildings in downtown Asheville, which include our Asheville City Hall, the Grove Arcade, which will become home to the National Accounting Office and later the National Climatic Data Center until the Veach Bailey building was built in 1994, and parts of the Haywood Park Hotel area. The other thing was the reason Asheville was chosen is it was a fairly isolated area from Axis powers, and it was thought that it would be hard to find. The Grove Park Inn would be home to detained foreign diplomats. So they would be held in an exchange program until they could be traded for other U.S. diplomats. So it was a very low security detainee camp for foreign diplomats at that time. Now, the Grove Park Inn would later be used as a recovery and recuperation area for U.S. soldiers after the war to decompress. Now, again, we've got these architects are discussing how can we get in on some of this governmental war contracts. So Stuart Rogers, he's a very young entrepreneurial designer and engineer, and he has this idea. He says, I think we've got all this talent, let's pull it together. So he calls Anthony Lord, Henry Gaines, and William Waldo Dodge to meet for lunch again at the S&W cafeteria. And they put together a small practice with Rogers, Gaines, Lord, and Dodge. But they still need a little bit more weight to the practice to obtain some of these more established clients. So they call upon Charles Waddell, a very prominent engineer who not only can build a robust engineering practice that will last many decades, but he also has a little bit of clout and can serve as some of the elder statesmen. They also bring in Earl Stillwell, who is a well-known name and a very talented architect, and they become one of the first incorporated architecture firms in the state of North Carolina. And as far as that tax status, typically an architectural firm would be known as a professional association, which was not typically incorporated at that time. Their first commission would be Moore General Hospital in Swannanoa. And this was a military hospital that was designed for the recuperation of soldiers that were thought could return back to battle. And this later would be turned into a tuberculosis treatment facility after the war in 1946. And it was demolished to now create the Swannanoa Women's Correctional Facility is on that site today. But it was constructed in an incredibly quick amount of time, about 3 months. And this would lead to other projects for military bases in Tennessee and Georgia. So this would be military bases as well as military hospitals in a time when incredible capacity was needed in that area. Not only do we have the government needing our resources in Asheville, they also seek out the Biltmore estate to assist in the war effort, and this is to take very valuable pieces of art from the National Gallery. So it's thought that very prominent museums in New York City and Washington, D.C. could be bombed by the Axis powers. That's what happened in Europe when a lot of artwork was looted, stolen, or destroyed. And so all these very valuable pieces are moved to the Biltmore estate and hidden inside of the Biltmore home where they can be safe until after the war. Now, at this time, Anthony Lord is becoming very involved with the Pack Library in their board, and he's going to help usher in a lot of new programs as far as new facilities and even building a new library later in the 70s and pushing to help integrate the library in the 1960s. But during World War II, he's doing a lot of work out at Biltmore. So he's designed some of the Biltmore dairy operations, and he's become very close with the state superintendent, Chauncey Beadle. And it's Beadle who suggests, why don't we take some of these pieces down to the Pack Library in Pack Square? Tony says, I think that's a great idea. So they build the structure out of 2x4s and chicken wire in the basement of Pack Library. And they're able to obtain permission from the National Gallery as a thank you for holding these pieces at the Biltmore estate. And they take wonderful works like Rembrandt, Picasso, very rare, valuable artwork, and hang it on this chicken wire structure for Asheville citizens to view in the basement of Pack Library. So just kind of a fun little story from Tony about that interesting and very incredible time in Asheville's history. Now, towards the end of World War II, things are a little bit shaky for this new firm called Six Associates that has been formed with these 5 architects and 1 engineer. And that's because Charles Waddell sadly dies in a car accident while traveling through West Asheville in 1945. And Dodge, he's going to decide to leave and start his own firm in 1948. He has his own health struggles. We discussed a little bit in part 1 about his service during World War I in the military and having respiratory issues related to chlorine gas and perhaps tuberculosis at that time. And he's going to retire fairly early in the 1950s while Six Associates is beginning to build their practice. So they kind of fall apart a little bit. Stuart Rogers, again, is really the rainmaker and leader, and he pulls everybody back together. And they decide to build a modern office with this group. So they've got Stuart Rogers, Anthony Lord, Henry Gaines, Earl Stillwell, and they will later add another engineer named Clint Minnick. Now they're going to build this beautiful office on Hendersonville Road. This is at 1905 Hendersonville Road, and this is going to involve many new facilities for them. So they're going to have offices for all those prominent architects and shareholders. They're going to have a nice lobby. They're going to have a large drafting room for all the associates, and then the basement will be where all the blueprints and production work of that design drawings are done. Now, during the 1950s, this is at the end of the war when a lot of soldiers are returning home with money in their pockets. They've also got the GI Bill to go back to school, and they're thinking about housing. And this is also at a time that our population is beginning to increase in Asheville's metro area as well as beyond in Buncombe County. So in 1940, we've got a population of 51,310. And this is not that different from the outbreak of the Great Depression at about 50,000. By 1950, we've gone up to 52,208, and 1960, we've gone up to 68,592, and this is coming from U.S. Census data. So we're seeing that population expand dramatically. Now, this is also at a time that urban renewal is starting to come back into the conversation of changing the fabric of downtown Asheville. Some of the city leaders at the time feel like it's looking run down, and they end up buying up a lot of property. Now, some of this is property owned by African Americans, some of it is property owned by white landlords that have let their properties fall into decay. And so they build 3 different housing projects that are designed by 6 associates, and those are Lee Walker Heights, Hillcrest, and Pisgah View Apartments. Lee Walker Heights is going to be located off of Biltmore Avenue in the same location that it is today, behind the Gaines Design Coca-Cola bottling plant. Hillcrest, if you look at the bottom picture on the slide, is across from what is now known as the Westgate or the Jeff Bowen Bridge, and it is also still a public housing facility today. And each of those were designed in 1948 and 1950. They would also design Pisgah View Apartments in West Asheville in 1951. And the original idea was to give these a nice feel. It was not meant to be a place where people would stay forever. It would be temporary housing. So it was kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you had people that were basically being kicked out of established neighborhoods to go to a place that would be foreign to them. Now, on the other hand, they were living in really what would be considered at the time deplorable conditions. So even in the late 40s and early 50s, some of these homes in what were considered the historic black neighborhoods did not have running water or reliable heat. Some even didn't have electricity. So for some of these people, it was a welcome change to move into a new home that was modern, clean, had electric lights, running water, and reliable steam heat. It's a very complicated subject, but it's one that is interesting to see how it has unfolded and changed Asheville. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, they were also designing very high-end homes, and 6 Associates was moving from these kind of traditional houses of colonial revival or Greek revival into more modern, or what we would even consider mid-century modern today. So I wanted to highlight just a couple. There are literally hundreds of these houses in Asheville, many with incredible design. One of these is 31 Griffin Circle that was designed by Anthony Lord. It mimics some of the features of his commercial buildings with kind of Bauhaus design elements, these large windows, and they were all designed to make you feel a certain way. So they had this incredible open air inside of them, were very calming when you walked in. And there was also 6 East Forest Road in Biltmore Forest, designed by Henry Gaines. And again, it's moving into this kind of more modern style. And we see this use of more flat, sharp lines in stone. Now, again, as I mentioned, there were many businesses, facilities that were designed by 6 associates. And some of those, so in North Carolina at this time, especially during World War II, we ramped up production of some munitions. So we were producing textiles. We had a company called Mills Manufacturing that was making silk parachutes for the military. We had Kierfont designing missile guidance systems in Black Mountain, and many, many other companies making wood products for use in military, automotive, and consumer goods. So wood production, furniture with companies like Thomasville, Lexington, 3 Mountaineers, and consumer goods. We had the Sales Bleachery, Gerber Baby Food, Ball Glass, just to name a few. And they needed these large manufacturing facilities and a company that could not only do the architecture, but could lay out a lot of the robust engineering and physical features of these companies. So, I mean, HVAC, plumbing, air handling, all of that needed to be done. And 6 Associates had the robust capability to do it. And as I mentioned, that started this push of manufacturing in Asheville began in the late 1920s with Beacon Blankets, Champion Fiber, and Inca Rayon were probably some of the bigger names at that time. So one of the larger ones I wanted to highlight is Inca Rayon because it would see several different iterations of 6 Associates architects affect its design. So in the original design in the late 1920s, Charles Waddell was involved with the water cooling system. So water was fed in from Hominy Creek that was not only used for cooling equipment, but for providing fire protection, as well as helping with Inca Lake, which was kind of the spring feeding all of that. And then Bill Dodge would be involved with designing some of the buildings, especially houses for Inca Village and buildings at the plant in the 1940s. And Tony Lord would be involved with designing two very modern buildings for Inca Rayon in the 1950s. And these would be the Inca Research Building, which still fronts Smoky Park Highway and is home to the campus of Asheville Buncombe Technical Community College, their Inca campus, as well as the administrative building, which sadly does not exist. It was demolished in 2024, and it was sited in such a way so that it would not disturb any trees. Anthony Lord, being a true Renaissance man, was also an environmentalist, and he cared very much about tree placement on the property and not cutting down any of the native hardwoods. Now, another line of business. So we've got to think about in culture of that time, we've got people need housing. After the war, they need a job. So we've got a need for manufacturing plants, but there's also a need for a sense of community. And a big line for Six Associates would be designing houses of worship. And one of the first projects they would do after World War II in 1945 was a new synagogue for Congregation Beth Hatafila. And this would be designed by Stuart Rogers in 1945 and commissioned by one of the elders at the synagogue, Hyman Dave, who himself loved great design. Now, this would be on Liberty Street, and their original synagogue had been located downtown on Spruce Street in the Jewish community and neighborhood, which was fairly prominent in that area. But the building was not sufficient to hold their growing congregation. So they came together to design this new structure, again, in that modern style that Rogers used on some of those gas stations. You can see some of that influence on that. And it happened to be on the site of Edwin Wiley Grove's former manor home. So a lot of people, we talked about Edwin Grove and Fred Seeley and their development of the Grove Park Inn in the first presentation, but a lot of people don't know where Grove lived. We've talked about Fred Seeley's Overlook Castle up on top of Sunset Mountain, but Grove had this manor home on Liberty Street, and the synagogue bought it after his death in 1927. It was leased out as a school for many years, and then it was demolished in the 1940s to construct this new synagogue. Now, also with many of these soldiers returning and youngster people matriculating through the Asheville City school system, there is a need for schools. And Six Associates is going to be called upon in their career to design everything from an elementary school to the entirety of a college campus. And one of their first projects is to design and reconfigure an existing building for Asheville Biltmore College. Now, at this time, Asheville's city school system is fairly robust and strong, but we don't have a university to call our own. There is a junior college. It's a 2-year junior college called Asheville Biltmore College that has had a fairly itinerant existence. So they've moved from building to building. They were supposedly going to be in part of the new Douglas Ellington designed Asheville High School, but it didn't work out, and their student body was continuing to grow. In 1942, proprietor of the Grove Park Inn and its architect Fred Seeley would pass away from a heart attack, and he lived in this incredible home that's featured on this slide, Overlook Castle, which was designed by Seeley in 1913 at the same time he was doing the Grove Park Inn. And it would take him 3 years to build this incredible manor home. He would add on to that during the 1920s, and it would eventually cover 20,000 square feet on 27 acres. Now, by the 1940s, his 4 children had grown up and moved out, and this was a lot for his wife to maintain. He did have staff that helped maintain the home, but after the Great Depression, that staff had been cut down dramatically. And so in 1949, Evelyn Grove Seeley, Fred Seeley's wife, decided to sell Overlook Castle. And as you can imagine, this would not be the easiest home to sell. It's got a lot of upkeep. It's also would require a very unique buyer. And she is approached by several members of the board of Asheville Biltmore College to sell this home to become their new campus. And she strikes a deal with them to give them a discount on it and sells them the home for what would be a significant amount of money at that time, $150,000. And they call upon Six Associates architect Anthony Lord to reconfigure this home for their new college campus. Now, in addition to the castle, there are 4 other outbuildings, which include a 5-car garage, a small barn, a small greenhouse that would be used by biology students later, and a 2-story stone carriage house and horse stables. There are also tennis courts available on the property that Seeley built for his children. Now, one of the more important projects is to build a truly legitimate library. So this slide will show the library at Overlook Castle, which is 2,200 square feet on its own. And it would be transformed into a library for all of these college students. So some things that were added were this kind of institutional looking lighting, new bookshelves, seating, and a desk area for the librarian. All of this would be brought up by students. So this is again another view of that large room to be the new library. The bedrooms of the home, there were 6 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms, would be configured into classrooms and offices for administration. The basement of this home, the former servants' quarters, would become the student union, and that 2-story stone carriage house and stables would become the medical science technology building for not only biology students, but an exchange program with Asheville Biltmore College and St. Joseph's nursing program to study microbiology. So their students would actually travel up Town Mountain to Overlook Castle where they would study. Now the board deliberated. Their plan was to continue growing Asheville Biltmore College, but they needed a little bit better facilities. So there was no gym there to play basketball games. Students at Asheville Biltmore College would have to travel down the mountain into downtown Asheville to Woodfin Street where the YMCA was located to play basketball games, and then travel back up the mountain to make it back in time for class. So there was also no dormitories at this area. If there was any inclement weather, it could make it difficult to travel up the mountain, and the school would be closed. Now, Anthony Lord penned this sketch, which was published in the Asheville Citizen-Times in the late 1950s. It would include the castle in the middle of the slide, surrounded by mid-century modern buildings, including new dormitories, classroom facilities, as well as some of these kind of chalet-looking buildings. And the university had bought about 300 acres in Chuns Cove, planning to expand the campus, but it was really deemed that this property was not practical for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. And so they ended up purchasing land in North Asheville in what was known as the Kimberly Lands. And this would be the area around what we know as Merriman Avenue, and they would have to create W.T. Weaver Boulevard to connect to Broadway behind what is now the university campus. Now the Kimberly Lands were owned by the Kimberly family, which Kimberly Avenue is named for. They also owned about 300 acres in what is now considered the Grove Park neighborhood, which Edwin Grove purchased from the Kimberly estate. So this is again on the Kimberly Lands. And this would be the new home at Asheville Biltmore College. Now, they were seeking status as a true North Carolina State University, but to meet that and gain more eligibility for grants, funding, and expanded student population, they needed better facilities. So they had to build new buildings. And one of the more prominent buildings on the campus is Ramsey Library. And this was designed by Anthony Lord and contained this kind of mid-century design and was constructed in 1961. Now, Six Associates was incredibly prolific in North Carolina, and they designed many other school campuses, including Western Carolina University, Warren Wilson College, of which they did the library, Gladfelter Student Union, as well as the Performing Arts Center and several dormitories, UNC Greensboro, Appalachian State University, Duke University, and many more. It's such a voluminous amount of output that they did. It could take us into a part 3 or part 4. Now they also were doing hospitals at the time, and a couple of the ones they did in Asheville were Mission Hospital, and this would be moving into a more modern facility off of Victoria Road from their original location off of Charlotte Street. And not only were they designing the building, but they were designing very innovative air purifying and sanitation systems for the hospital. Obviously, in a hospital, you're going to need more robust HVAC systems for sanitation purposes, but they also wanted to make the hospital less intimidating. So a lot of the spaces where people were waiting were much more open with better lighting and nice art moderne design even in the 40s. They also did work on Mission St. Joseph's Hospital, this being the old building. Six Associates was designed their new building in the 1970s as well when this building was demolished. Now they were also designing retail large spaces. So you got to think, I mean, we're doing small houses in areas like Biltmore Forest and Grove Park, and we're doing these massive engineering projects that not only involve grading, but all the electrical engineering, water supply, things like that. And one of the big projects they do as West Asheville is beginning to develop and come into a zone is the Westgate Shopping Center. So this is an aerial photograph of the Westgate Bridge we know as Jeff Bowen Bridge today, heading into West Asheville, with that Westgate Shopping Center coming into play. Now, just to give you guys an idea of perspective of what Patton Avenue looked like, this is Patton Avenue heading west, and this will be the future site of Harry's Cadillac and Pontiac, we know as Harry's GMC or Harry's on the Hill today. So quite rural. This is when they had begun grading that property, and this was only a 4-lane road rather than 6. Just to give you guys a little bit of perspective, this would be the area under that Westgate Bridge in the 50s. This would be the Bell family's main auto parts company. This is the site of New Belgium today, or River Arts District, but it looked completely different when we're coming out of the era of the 1940s and 50s. Again, this is another view of Patton Avenue heading west towards what would later become Harry's up on the hill, towards where we see the mountains over on the right-hand side of the slide. Now, another thing as we're developing the economy is that we needed better travel facilities. So train travel was starting to dwindle by this time, and air travel was really coming into its own. But Asheville only had a couple small landing strips, and these were the Asheville-Hendersonville Airway, as well as the Owen Landing Field, which is now Carrier Park. So that was its own air park at the time, is what it was called, where smaller airplanes would land. So one of the first projects was designing a larger terminal for the Asheville-Hendersonville Airport. And this is a photograph from 1957 when actor Robert Mitchum was coming to film the movie Thunder Road, which would be the cult classic bootlegger and B movie at drive-in theaters. Now, by 1960, there was more of a clamor for a better, more modern airport. And again, 6 associates got the call. And they were called upon not only to design the terminal building, but the air traffic control tower. So this involved work between Stuart Rogers and the Federal Aviation Administration to make sure they were meeting all the requirements of a proper airport. And that would be when we would see airlines like Delta and Piedmont Airlines having regular service to Asheville, increasing tourism, travel, and business meetings in the area. Now, as I mentioned, there were a number of notable alumni who came through the ranks at 6 Associates, and I really feel remiss at not being able to mention everyone's names, but I wanted to highlight a couple with connection to the facility that we're at this evening. So this is a picture of Anthony Lord in his office at that building on Hendersonville Road. One of the notable alumni was a gentleman named Bert King, who had come to Asheville from Greenville as a young man, and he had studied architecture at NC State after serving in the Air Force during World War II, flying C-47s in some of the most difficult missions. And he began his career in that large drafting room on the building at Hendersonville Road, but he hated working alongside all these other people, and he decided to strike out on his own with his own company called J. Bertram King and Associates. And they would still collaborate with 6 Associates on other projects like design for commercial buildings, some new buildings on the college campus of UNC Asheville. And Bert King had a very prolific career doing residential real estate. And he was known for this indirect lighting, high ceilings, slate floors, and exotic wood like this Honduran mahogany, and a picture of this home he did in North Asheville. Now, he had an architect that worked with him named Charles Sappenfield, who had also studied at NC State and would have a fairly prolific career designing homes in Lakeview Park in North Asheville, as well as some other commercial buildings like the Greek Orthodox Church in Montford and what would later become the Livingston Street Towers. So he was very into creating good senior health living facilities. And the building that we were doing the presentation in on the night of November 13th was Warren Wilson Presbyterian Church. And many times it is credited towards J. Bertram King's firm, but it was actually Charles Sappenfield that collaborated with their pastor at the time, Fred Oler, to design this building. And so they came up with this very modern, beautiful building that was open air, Warren Wilson Presbyterian Church. And inside it featured this kind of A-frame design and stone that was sourced locally. Sappenfield even collaborated with Pastor Oler to design much of the furniture to have Presbyterian symbology to it. Now, the cross that is illuminated in the back of the sanctuary was also part of this design and constructed locally. There's slate floor and much wood throughout. So this is some more of Sappenfield's work that he did on this church. And most of the construction was done by Warren Wilson students. So that was something that would be fairly unique, but not uncommon to universities that utilize student labor at the time. This would be a big part of their culture. Now, we've got to keep in mind the age of these architects. And one thing that I think of as being fairly notable is their age at the time that this firm chose to reinvent itself. So they would have been beyond middle age at that time in the 1950s when they're building an incredibly prolific and busy firm taking on large commissions all throughout the Southeast. And this would be out of the original founders. We've got four that stayed. The original six associates were Anthony Lord, Henry Gaines, Stuart Rogers, and Earl Stillwell that would stay with Six Associates until the 1970s. So they're all going to retire at different points during this decade, and the firm would continue on under leadership of several different presidents and shareholders until they are sold and bought in the 1980s by a company called E&G. And that's really something I'd like to cover in a third installment of this story because there's just so much to hold there. Now, I think of summarizing this in a couple ways, that they have a very big impact on Asheville, and this would be changing the way we move through our city. They designed buildings that really enhanced Asheville and changed the built environment. So this was to meet the needs of a society that had changed dramatically after World War II. Most of these buildings are still in use today and very functional. So I think it stands to say that a lot of them have stood the test of time. Thank you everybody so much for that watch part one and attended the presentation. I hope you'll send this on to other people and we can continue to bring more research and nuance to the story of Six Associates. If you want to come learn more about Asheville's history, you can invite us to come present one of these presentations at your office or facility, or you can come take a tour with us at Mountaineer Motor Tours in our 1923 Ford Model T. I've got my contact information here as well as in the description of the video if you'd like to get in contact with me. Thank you so much.